For decades, African Americans have been constantly trying to fight for their freedom in a segregated United States. However, it wasn't until the civil rights activities and demonstrations that occurred in the 1950s that ultimately led to the passage of the four major civil rights acts between 1964 and 1968. From nonviolent protests to bus boycotts, as shown in the images, the overall success of the civil rights movement stemmed from the active participation and cooperation between grassroots civil rights activism and civil rights reformers and the federal government. For grassroots civil rights activists such as Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and members of the NAACP, perhaps the most major motivating factors were religion, leadership, and a strong sense of self-pride. As stated in Malcolm X's description of police brutality against members of the Nation of Islam, his main goal was to advocate self-reliance, Black pride, and unity. With most of their meetings originating in churches or other places of worship, strong communities were formed as a result in favor of the civil rights movement. Having strength in numbers, many activists were motivated to organize petitions and nonviolent protests with a strong determination for what they believed in. After being arrested for his nonviolent protests, Martin Luther King states in his letter in Birmingham jail that oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The urge for freedom will eventually come. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom. Something without has reminded him that he can gain it. From the perspectives of civil rights leaders, the time had come to pursue their goals of improving Black economic opportunities, living conditions, and establish desegregation in the United States. On the scale of the federal government, there were different motivating factors that were related to the civil rights movement. For one, Lyndon B. Johnson was adamant about pursuing President Kennedy's legislative agenda that he had fought for so long, until his assassination. Other motivations stemmed from the presidential campaign and how he strategically developed relationships with civil rights leaders as well as racist Southerners for public power and support. During a phone call with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on November 25, 1963, Johnson made sure to inform the Reverend about what is going on with the House of Representatives, as well as the fact that he isn't going to give up an inch until the Civil Rights Bill was passed. At the same time, Johnson was also speaking with people who were against civil rights legislations, such as Charles Halleck on June 22, 1964, where he states that he doesn't want to keep the congressmen working during the holidays and to pass the bills as soon as possible. The diction that President Lyndon B. Johnson uses for each group of people that he speaks to is strategic in pursuing his end goal of ending poverty as well as racial injustice in the United States. Establishing his relationships with grassroots civil rights activists allowed for Johnson to be able to receive additional funding for his plans of building what he would call a great society. In the eyes of some congressmen, particularly in the South, civil rights legislation shouldn't have been passed, and segregation should have continued since this is how it's always had been in the United States. On the other hand, other congressmen, as well as the President Lyndon B. Johnson, believed that it was time to change and decided to promote their goal of the passage of civil rights legislation. On October of 1966, the Black Panther Party platform talked about what they wanted and what they believed in, which was the power to determine the destiny of our Black community, full employment for our people, as well as an immediate end to police brutality and the murder of Black people. This was also proven in a poster that mentioned of 44 total arrests from cops that arrested Blacks who were trying to protest for equal education. The irony of the situation that is shown in the image is that the people who were trying to fight against police brutality would end up facing the police and be arrested themselves for fighting for their rights. Between grassroots activists and national politicians, neither were more responsible for the civil rights reform. Working from behind the scenes, Grassroots activists were actively gaining public awareness as well as support for civil rights reform so that national politicians are able to act on those. However, all should not be credited to the activists only, since national politicians, such as President Lyndon B. Johnson, were able to spin the odds against his favor with the government and ultimately allow for the passage of the 4 major civil rights acts. Both groups were inevitably responsible and should be equally credited for the civil rights reform, because without one of them, none of the laws would have been able to be passed.